The needle's eye was a small, bright world. Eliza Whitlow kept her gaze fixed there, a pinpoint of metal shining in the yellow lamplight. Her thumb and forefinger worked the linen thread, pushing, pulling, locking the stitch. Outside the window, the New Mexico territory of 1877 was a vast, dark thing of grit and distance. But in this small room, there was only the steady rhythm of her work. She was mending a canvas tarp for Mr. Abernathy, one so thick it made her fingers ache, but it was paid work. A low rumble vibrated through the floorboards, too steady for the distant thunder that flickered purple against the high desert horizon. It was the night train, the 8:15, hauling steel and ambition west. Its whistle cut through the dry air, a long, lonely cry that sounded less like a warning and more like the heartbeat of the new age rolling in to crush the old one. Eliza paused, her needle halfway through a seam. That sound was the soundtrack to her widowhood. She was 27 years old, a number that felt ridiculous, like a dress made for someone else. In this air, 27 felt like 57. The dryness leached the youth from a person's skin, and the grief leached the light from their eyes. Her husband, Thomas, had been gone for 2 years. He had not been a gunman, nor a soldier. He had been a carpenter, a man who liked the smell of fresh-cut pine. He had died in a pointless saloon clash, caught between a drunken regulator and a card sharp with a fast hand. He had bled out on a dirty floor before she could even get her bag of remedies. The incident had been ruled an accident, closed by Sheriff Carter Hale before the dust had settled. Pointless. The word stuck in her throat like a burr. That loss had scoured her clean of most illusions. It had also left her with this room above the general store and a reputation. She was the town seamstress, the mender of torn shirts and freight wagon covers, but she was also the town's unofficial nurse. Dry Creek was a scar on the high plateau. A handful of wooden buildings huddled against the red dust that blew in from the plains. It lived on the promise of the railroad and the rumor of silver, but it survived on mule freight and desperation. The social lines were drawn as clearly as a map. Sheriff Carter Hale ran the town, or near enough. He was a big man who smiled with his teeth and kept his eyes on the railroad surveyors. His loyalty was not to the law. It was to the spur line he believed would make him a rich man. His regulators, as they called themselves, were just hired meanness. They wore badges Hale had provided, but they worked for the railroad's interests, clearing squatters and managing the Apache problem. And the fear of the Apache was the third pillar of Dry Creek. It was a low, constant hum beneath the wind, a fear of shadows at dusk, of smoke where no smoke should be. The name Taza, a Chiricahua war leader, was whispered like a curse, a boogeyman for a town that needed one. They said he knew the canyons like the lines on his own hand, that he carried an old wound that never healed, and that his eyes saw everything. He was, the rumors said, an uncle to some child, but the detail only made him seem more alien, not less. Eliza pressed the pad of her thumb against the needle's dull end, pushing it through the last fold of canvas. Her hands were her life. They were calloused from the thick thread, stained brown from the iodine and willow bark she boiled for fevers, and scarred from the one time a shattered bone had slipped while she was setting it. They brought her torn canvas, but they also brought her fevers, lung sickness, and the wounds from knife fights. She was cheaper than the alcoholic Dr. Miles, and, most people said, more reliable. Her moral compass had been simplified by her husband's death. She believed in one thing now: you save the life in front of you first. You ask questions later. The politics of it, whether the man was a regulator or a rustler, Mexican or white, was just noise. A lung was a lung. It needed to be patched. A fever was a fever. It needed to break. This belief was her private religion, and it was a dangerous one in a town like Dry Creek, a town that demanded a person pick a side. Hale watched her. She knew he did. He did not like her neutrality. To him, neutrality looked a lot like defiance. She finished the seam, knotted the thread, and bit it clean. She folded the heavy tarp, the smell of dust and old cargo rising from it. Her gaze drifted to her sewing box, a large tin painted with faded roses. It held her spools of thread, her beeswax, her buttons, and her shears. And, at the bottom, beneath a false floor of cardboard and velvet, lay the pepper box. It was a small, ugly 4-barrel pistol. Thomas had insisted she buy it from a traveling salesman years ago. She had hated it. She still did. It felt cold and wrong. A tool for unmaking, the opposite of her needle. But after Thomas died, after she had sat alone in this room while the regulators celebrated their clearance of the saloon brawl downstairs, she had cleaned it. She had oiled it. She had learned how it worked. She kept it hidden, not because it was a secret, but because it was a contradiction. It was the one tool she owned that she prayed she would never use. It was the ask later part of her creed, given weight and metal. The air in the room was growing thick. The approaching storm was pressing the heat down. Eliza stood and stretched, her back aching. She walked to the window, pushing aside the thin cotton curtain below. The main street of Dry Creek was empty, the red dust settled by the evening damp. The only light came from the saloon and from Sheriff Hale's office, where he was likely meeting with the railroad men again. The mumble of their plans was the worst-kept secret in the territory. Copper, a rich vein of it, supposedly running right under the lands the Chiricahua held sacred. The railroad wanted a spur line to it. To get the spur line, they needed the land. To get the land, they needed the Apache gone. Hale and his regulators were the broom meant to sweep away the trouble. Eliza looked out at the high plains, where the lightning now split the sky, a silent, flickering violence. She thought of the people out there, the ones being hunted. She thought of Taza, the man whose name was used to frighten children. She wondered if his hands were calloused, too. Her own hands rested on the windowsill. They were good hands. They knew how to mend a torn shirt, how to set a bone, how to soothe a fever. They knew how to make things whole. She looked down at them, at the faint silver scars and the needle pricks on her fingertips. The territory felt like that canvas tarp, ripped and fraying, pulling apart at the seams. A cold, sharp question settled in her heart, one that came every time she heard the train whistle or saw Hale's shadow. What good was a needle against the blade of a railroad track? What good was sewing cloth when the whole land needed to be sewn back together? The last flicker of lightning had passed, swallowed by the rising wind. When the sound came, it was not the scrape of a boot or the polite rap of knuckles. It was a heavy, desperate thudding on her door, the sound of a fist losing its strength. Eliza froze. Her heart, which had been resting, gave a hard kick against her ribs. No one in Dry Creek knocked like that, not at this hour, with the storm turning the sky black. The wind howled, rattling the window frame, trying to force its way in. The thudding came again, softer this time, almost a collapse against the wood. Her first thought was of the pepper box in its tin. Her second was of Sheriff Hale. Trouble came in many forms, but it always came. She moved away from the window, wiping her damp palms on her apron. She kept the oil lamp in her left hand, holding it high, and used her right to draw the bolt. She opened the door only a few inches, a small triangle of light cutting into the churning darkness of the boardwalk. At first, she saw nothing, just the rain, which had begun to fall in earnest, hitting the dust and turning it to dark mud. Then she looked down. A man was kneeling on her landing, his body half-shadowed. He was not a man from the town. He was Apache. His black hair was plastered to his skull, and his buckskin tunic was torn and dark with rain. He was barefoot. His feet, visible in the spill of lamplight, were bleeding, a lattice of cuts from rock and thorn. He was holding a bundle. He looked up, and his eyes found hers. This was him. This was the name, the shadow, Taza, but the face she saw was not the monster of town gossip. It was a mask of exhaustion and terror. his features drawn tight over the bone. He looked, she thought with a strange disconnect, like a man who had run for 100 miles. He was holding the bundle out to her. It was a small body, wrapped tightly in stiff leather, a tiny, gray-faced infant. "Please," he whispered. The word was a gasp, torn from his throat. He did not speak like an enemy. He spoke like a man at the end of all things. Eliza's hand tightened on the door. Her knuckles went white. This was not just an Apache. This was Taza, the raider, the man Hale had a bounty for. To open the door to him was not just charity. It was treason. It was a death warrant. She could smell the high desert ozone on him, the metallic tang of old blood, and something else, the animal panic of a man protecting his young. She should have slammed the door. She should have bolted it, pushed the heavy dresser in front of it, and hidden in the dark until he went away or died. That was the law of Dry Creek. That was survival. The bundle in his arms moved. A tiny, fluttering breath. A sound like a kitten. Too weak to be a cry. The baby's lips were cracked and blue. The image of Thomas, his life spilling onto the saloon floor, flashed in her mind. He had died for nothing, surrounded by men who saw him as an obstacle. She looked at the child, and the politics of the territory dissolved. The rumors, the railroad, the copper mines, they all burned away like mist. There was only the code she had made for herself. You save the life first. She stepped back, pulling the door wide. "Get in," she said, her voice low and rough, "before you are seen." He did not seem to understand the words, but he understood the gesture. He lunged forward, stumbling over the threshold, his bleeding feet smearing the clean floorboards. He half fell against the wall, his chest heaving, but he did not release his grip on the child. He kept his body curled around it, shielding it even now. Inside. Eliza shot the bolt. The sound was loud, final. She put the lamp on the table, her hands shaking now. The room, which had been her sanctuary, suddenly felt like a trap. He was here. The boogeyman was in her sewing room. "The child," she said, moving toward him. "Let me see the child." He flinched, pulling the bundle tighter. His eyes were wild, scanning the room, seeing the sewing tin, the herbs, the narrow bed. "I will not harm her," Eliza said, forcing her voice to be calm. She held up her hands, palms open. "She is sick. I can help. I am a nurse." He watched her, his gaze intense. He seemed to be weighing the last of his options. He looked at the rain lashing the window, then back at the baby, whose breathing was shallow, a faint rasp. Slowly, as if it cost him all his remaining strength, he held the child out. "Milk," he said. The word was thick. "Please." Eliza took the bundle. It was so light, the leather was stiff, but inside, the rabbit fur lining was damp and cold. She unwrapped the baby's face. A little girl, perhaps only a few weeks old, Pahana, little son. Her skin was the color of whey, her eyes shut, her small mouth opening and closing in a terrible, silent plea. She was dying of starvation. Eliza's breath caught. Goat's milk and sugar would be too harsh. Water and honey would not be enough. The baby needed a mother. A pain, sharp and familiar, pierced Eliza's chest. It had been 6 months since her own daughter, born silent and still, had been buried next to Thomas. 6 months of a useless, aching fullness in her breasts. A body that had prepared for a life that never came. She had milk. The realization was a physical blow. She looked at Taza. He was slumped against the wall, watching her, his pride shattered, his life balanced on the edge of her needle. "Sit," she commanded, pointing to the small stool by her hearth. He did not move. "Sit," she said again, firmer. He obeyed, lowering himself onto the stool, his body rigid with suspicion. Eliza turned her back to him, not for modesty, but for focus. She walked to a rocking chair, the one she had not been able to bring herself to sell. She sat, the wooden runners groaning. She unbuttoned the high collar of her dress, her fingers quick and practiced. The old grief rose in her, hot and suffocating. This was a violation. This was a mockery of her own loss. But as she looked down at the child's gray face, another instinct took over, older and deeper than grief. It was the simple, animal imperative to feed. She brought the child to her breast. The baby was too weak to latch. Eliza squeezed a single drop of milk onto her own finger and touched it to the baby's lips. The child shuddered, the tiny mouth rooted, searching. Eliza guided her. "That's it," she whispered. "Live. You must live." There was a moment of fumbling, and then a connection. The child latched on, her pull weak at first, then stronger, a desperate, greedy drawing. Eliza closed her eyes, a single tear tracing a hot path through the dust on her cheek. It was agony. It was the most profound relief she had ever known. The terrible, aching pressure in her chest began to ease, replaced by the pull of a new life. Her hands, which she had thought were only good for mending canvas and cleaning wounds, were steady. They held the baby's head, cradling the fragile skull. She rocked, the rhythm automatic. The storm raged outside, but in the small yellow circle of lamplight, there was only the sound of a child feeding. When she opened her eyes, Taza was watching. He had not moved from the stool. His face was unreadable, a mask of hard planes and shadow, but his eyes were fixed on his niece. He saw the tears on Eliza's face, and he saw the act she was performing. He slid from the stool to his knees. He did not speak. He lowered his head and pressed his right palm flat against his heart. It was not a surrender. It was an oath, a thanks so deep it had no need for words. Eliza merely nodded, her throat too tight to speak. The baby's breathing was evening out. A faint touch of color was returning to her cheeks. She was alive. It was then that Eliza heard it, a different sound through the rain, a footstep on the boardwalk, pausing directly outside her door. Her body went cold. She looked past Taza, to the window. The curtain was still pulled back. A shadow passed, silhouetted by the light from the saloon down the street. It was a woman, bundled in a shawl, hurrying against the storm. But the shadow had stopped. It had stopped for 1, 2, 3 seconds. Long enough to see the shapes inside, long enough to see the silhouette of a man where no man should be, and a woman in a rocking chair. It was Mrs. Gable, the sheriff's cousin. The shadow moved on, disappearing into the rain. Eliza knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that it was too late. The rumor was already airborne, faster than the prairie wind. By morning, Sheriff Hale would come knocking, and he would not be asking for milk. The baby, full and warm, had fallen asleep. Eliza gently pulled her away, adjusting her dress. The baby's wrappings were soaked. As Eliza shifted the stiff leather, her fingers brushed against something tied around the child's neck. It was a small amulet, a cluster of brilliant bluebird feathers and a single hawk feather, tied with sinew. It was intricate work, clean and precise. It was not from this part of the territory. This was from the Dragoon Mountains, far to the south. They had run a very long way. Eliza looked at the sleeping child, then at the warrior on her floor. He was watching her, his gratitude hardening back into vigilance. She placed the baby in her empty mending basket, lining it with a clean wool shawl. The child was safe for this hour. Eliza stood and went to her medicine chest. She took out a bottle of iodine and a roll of clean linen. She walked back to Taza. She knelt on the floor in front of him, placing the supplies between them. The floorboards were smeared with his blood. "Your feet," she said. He recoiled, his hand instinctively moving to the knife she had not seen at his belt. "I am a healer," she said, holding his gaze. "Let me." He stared at her, the silence stretching, broken only by the wind. He was deciding whether she was a savior or a trap. Finally, he gave a short, sharp nod. He extended his left foot. Eliza took it in her hand. It was caked in mud and blood. She began to clean the wounds. Her needle-pricked fingers now gentle and sure. As she worked, binding the cuts, she made a quiet vow, not to him, but to the room, to the memory of her husband. If her hands could hold a needle, they could hold a life. It did not matter whose. The gray light of dawn was just beginning to filter through the window, turning the rain-streaked glass into a sheet of slate. Eliza had finished cleaning and bandaging Taza's feet. The wounds were deep, but the bleeding had stopped. She had scrubbed the bloody smears from her floorboards. Using the last of the storm's rainwater, her hands moving with a frantic, silent efficiency. The baby, Pahana, slept soundly in the mending basket, full and warm for the first time in days. Taza sat on the small stool, his back against the wall. He had not slept. He watched Eliza, his eyes tracking her every movement. The suspicion had not left him, but it was now overlaid with a profound, heavy gratitude that felt more binding than iron. Eliza rose from her knees, the damp rag in her hand. The air in the room was thick with unspoken things, the iodine's sharp scent, the smell of wet buckskin, the coal dust from her hearth. "They will come," she said quietly. It was not a question. He nodded once. "The woman, she saw—" "My floor is thin," Eliza said, walking to the center of the room. She tapped a patch of worn planks, where a tattered rag rug lay. "There is a cellar, small. For coal in winter, it is all I have." His eyes followed her. He understood immediately. A sound from the street below snapped the tension, not the soft squelch of a lone traveler in the mud, but the heavy, measured tread of multiple men, punctuated by the jingle of spurs. They stopped directly below her landing. "Now," she whispered. Taza moved without a sound. He scooped Pahana from the basket, wrapping her in the shawl so quickly the child did not stir. Eliza threw back the rug and gripped the small iron ring. Lifting the trapdoor, a puff of cold, mineral air rose from the darkness. Taza looked at her, then at the black square. He lowered himself in, his bandaged feet finding a hold she did not know was there. He settled the baby against his chest and looked up, a shadow within a shadow. Eliza started to close the door. "Wait!" His voice was a low rumble. He reached up, his hand covered in the grime of her cellar. He pressed something into her palm. It was the bluebird amulet he had taken from Pahana's neck. Before she could react, he sank back, and she lowered the door. It fit flush with the floor. She kicked the rug back over it, her heart hammering so hard against her ribs it felt like it might break through the bone. The knock came. It was not a fist. It was the hard, wooden crack of a pistol butt against her door. Eliza Whitlow. The voice was deep, and it carried, "Sheriff Carter Hale, open the door. This is official business." Eliza pressed her hands to her apron, trying to wipe the sudden, cold sweat from them. She had to hide the rags she used to clean Taza's feet. She looked wildly around, then crossed the room and shoved the damp, bloodied linen into the cold pot-belly stove. She took a deep breath, walked to the door, and slid the bolt. The sheriff filled the frame. He was a broad man, his size emphasized by a long duster that was soaked at the hem. He wore his badge pinned to his vest, a spot of silver against the mud-brown wool. Behind him, on the landing, stood two of his regulators. Their faces were blank and mean, and their hands rested on the holsters at their hips. Hale smiled, but the smile did not touch his eyes. His gaze went past her, sweeping the small room in a single, comprehensive glance. "Morning, Sheriff," Eliza said. She leaned against the door jamb, forcing a weariness into her voice she did not entirely have to fake. "You are out early. The storm barely settled." "Trouble does not wait for the weather." "Eliza," Hale said. He took off his hat, slapping it against his thigh. spraying droplets of mud onto her clean step. Mrs. Gable paid me a visit last night, worried half to death. She was passing by in the rain and thought she saw shadows in your window. Said it looked like you had company. He looked pointedly at the rocking chair in the corner, the one that had been still for 6 months. Eliza managed a dry chuckle. Company, Sheriff? You know who my company is? She pointed to the folded canvas tarp on her work table. Mr. Abernathy's freight cover, and I have got a pile of shirts from the stage line that smell worse than a dead mule. Other than that, she said, her voice flat, I only have needle, thread, and some leftover chicken bones. You are welcome to them if you are hungry. Hale's eyes narrowed. He did not appreciate the humor. He stepped inside, forcing her to move back. The regulators stayed on the landing, but they watched, their presence a weight in the air. The sheriff walked the perimeter of the room. It took him less than 10 seconds. He touched the mending basket. It was empty. He ran a finger along the windowsill. He looked at the floor, which was still damp in patches. You have been cleaning, he observed. The wind blew the rain in under the door. Eliza said smoothly, It makes a mess of the floorboards. You know that. He stopped in the middle of the room, standing directly on top of the rag rug. Eliza held her breath. If the baby cried, if Taza shifted, if a single plank groaned. I know you think you are outside of this town's business. Eliza, Hale said, his voice dropping to a confidential, threatening purr. I know you helped that Mexican freighter last month when he got cut up. I know you set the arm of that rail worker everyone said was a union man. You think you are Florence Nightingale of the high desert. But that neutrality is a luxury. And it is a luxury this town cannot afford right now. I do not know what you mean, Sheriff, she said, gripping her hands together to stop them from shaking. I mean this. He reached inside his duster and pulled out a piece of paper. It was a wanted poster, the ink stark and new. He unfolded it and held it up. Let me see. Taza, Chiricahua Apache, wanted for murder, theft of livestock, and inciting rebellion. Eliza kept her face a mask of polite disinterest. $500, Hale said, tapping the number. That is a lot of money, paid for by the Transcontinental Rail Company. He pointed, and she saw it, the official seal of the railroad, pressed into the paper next to the bounty. But that is not the part that should interest you, he continued. He lowered the poster, and his gaze locked onto hers, his eyes as cold and gray as the morning light. Read the bottom line. And an additional $50 for information leading to the arrest of his unknown female accomplice. Eliza felt the blood drain from her face. Unknown, female, accomplice. It was not Mrs. Gable. It was not a guess. This poster had been printed before last night. They had been watching her. They had been waiting for Taza, and they had already decided she was the one who would help him. Her neutrality, her work as a healer, her isolation, they had not seen it as harmless. They had seen it as a weakness, a door left unbolted. They had not been asking if she had company. They had been telling her they knew. $50, Hale said, folding the paper slowly. A nice sum for a seamstress. You hear anything? Eliza, you see anyone who does not belong, you send word. It would be a shame if people got the wrong idea. It would be a tragedy if someone thought you were that. Accomplice. He put his hat back on, tugging the brim low. You have a good day. Mrs. Whitlow. Keep that needle sharp. He turned and left. His boots were heavy on the wooden stairs. The two regulators followed, casting one last look into her room before disappearing. Eliza bolted the door. She slumped against it, her entire body trembling. The trap had been set before Taza ever knocked. She had not made a choice to cross a line. Sheriff Hale had drawn the line, and he had placed her on the other side. There was no going back. The quiet, grieving, neutral widow was gone. In her place was an unknown female accomplice. She scrambled to the rug and threw it back. She lifted the trapdoor. Taza emerged, his face grim, He held the baby, who was awake but quiet, her dark eyes blinking in the sudden light. He was smudged with coal dust, making his features look even starker. He had heard every word. He stepped onto the floor and looked at Eliza. He saw the terror in her eyes. He saw that she was not just a healer. She was now a fugitive. He gently passed Pahana to her. Eliza took the child automatically, her arms finding the familiar hold, the baby's warmth a small anchor in the flood of her fear. The child was healthy, her breathing easy, her skin warm. She had fed well. Taza stood to his full height. He looked at the door, then at Eliza. He placed his hand on his chest. "He speaks with a snake's tongue," Taza said, his English slow and careful. You lied. For this one." He brushed a finger against Pahana's cheek. "And for me." "They were trapping me," Eliza whispered, her voice hoarse. "They were trapping me before you even came." "It does not matter," Taza said. He pressed his hand harder against his heart. "You gave milk to my sister's child. Now you give your honor. This is a debt of blood and milk. It is a debt that cannot be forgotten. My life is now bound to this." The space between them was no longer just fear. It was something new. A rough and solid alliance that had been forged in the dark, under the threat of Hale's law. Eliza nodded, accepting the new reality. "We have to leave. We cannot stay here. They will be back." "Yes, they will watch the town," Taza said. He went to the window, peering through the smallest crack in the curtain. "We wait for dark. Then we move." Where, Eliza asked, rocking the baby gently. "Where can we possibly go?" "To the Red Valley," he said. "South. My mother's people are there. They hide from the railroad. We find Shema. She is the elder. She is wise. She will give us shelter." "How far?" 2 days, maybe 3. The walking is hard." He glanced at his bandaged feet, then at her. "It will be hard for you." "I am stronger than I look," Eliza said. The fear was already hardening into resolve. She had the rest of the day. She moved with purpose. She could not take much. She spread a large oilcloth on her bed. First, her tools. She took her best steel needles, a spool of heavy linen thread, and another of waxed sinew, her shears. Next, her medicines. She packed the small brown bottle of carbolic acid, her tin of comfrey salve, a bundle of dried willow bark, and the last of her iodine. She tucked in her mother's leather-bound journal, the pages filled with remedies and dosages. She went to her sewing tin. She lifted the false bottom and took out the pepper box. It was heavy and cold. She checked the loads, her hands steady, and wrapped it in a piece of flannel, placing it in the very center of her roll. She was about to pack the last of her dried jerky in a canteen when she remembered the surveyor, the man whose coat she had mended last week, the one who worked for the railroad. He had been drunk and had forgotten his map case. She had been meaning to return it. She pulled the folded paper from a drawer. It was not a government map. It was a private survey. She unrolled it. Her eyes scanned the lines, the elevations, the pencil marks, and she saw it. A thick dotted line, marked Proposed Spur. It cut straight across the territory, heading south, right toward the area Taza had called the Red Valley. It ran directly through the lands the town gossip said were sacred to the Apache. Taza came to her side, his gaze fixed on the paper. "The snake!" he whispered, his voice vibrating with anger. He traced the dotted line with his finger. "This is it. This is why they hunt. This is the copper." Eliza folded the map carefully and placed it with her journal. It was not just a map. It was evidence. It was the why that Hale had not bothered to explain. She finished her bundle. It was small, but it was her entire life, her skill, her knowledge, her secrets, and her defense. As the sun began to dip low, painting the sky in shades of bruised purple and orange, Eliza went to her door. She took a scrap of paper from her table and a piece of charcoal from the hearth. She thought for a long moment. then wrote 2 lines. Closed, due to sand wind. She tacked it to the outside of her door. It was a lie, and it was the truth. The life she had known was closed. A new, terrible wind was blowing, and she was stepping out into it. She turned back to the room, to Taza and the child, and began the long wait for the night. The moon was a sliver, just enough to turn the mud in the alley silver. Taza went first. He did not climb down from the back window. He seemed to pour himself over the sill onto the low shed roof below, his bandaged feet making no sound. He was a shadow detaching itself from a deeper shadow. He held up his arms. Eliza, her heart a cold stone in her chest, passed Pahana to him. The child was bundled so tightly only the top of her dark-haired head was visible. Then, Eliza handed down her own small, heavy roll of supplies. She hitched up her skirts, feeling clumsy and loud, and eased herself over the sill. Her boots scraped the wood. The sound was like a gunshot in the heavy, damp air. She froze, her body halfway out the window. Taza pulled her down, his hand strong and sure on her forearm. He put a finger to his lips. They waited. 1 minute, 2. Eliza could hear the drunk laughter from the saloon. 2 streets over, it sounded like it was on another planet. No one shouted, no door slammed. "We go," he whispered, his voice barely disturbing the air. They did not take the road. They moved through the spaces between things. They slid into a deep, muddy arroyo that stank of alkali and dead water, using it as a trench to leave the town's small perimeter. They crossed the high plateau, keeping to the shadows of the mesquite and juniper. The land Eliza had always seen as empty and flat was, she realized, a landscape of folds and hollows. It was not empty at all. It was full of watchers. Taza moved like smoke, even with his feet bound in her linen. He seemed to brush the ground without touching it. Eliza felt like a cow, her wool skirts catching on thorns, her town boots dislodging stones. Twice, he stopped to pull a cactus needle from her hem. "You walk on your heels," he whispered, stopping so suddenly she almost ran into him. He held Pahana against his chest, the baby sleeping through the steady, gliding motion. "You strike the earth. It is an announcement." He pointed to her feet, then to his own. "Place the foot, roll the weight, speak softly to the ground. The ground will not betray you if you ask it." She tried. It was a new way of thinking, not just walking, but placing her feet, considering every step as an intrusion. It slowed her down, but the silence she achieved was a small victory. By the first cold light of dawn, they were miles south, hidden in a wash of sandstone. They were, for the moment, safe. Taza gently passed the baby to Eliza so she could feed her. He sat and began to unwrap the bandages on his feet. The linen was shredded and caked with dark mud. Eliza finished with the baby and put her back in the mending basket sling. She knelt in front of him, her professionalism taking over. "The dirt will poison the cuts," she said, her voice quiet. She unrolled her bundle, her hands finding the small bottle of carbolic acid and a fresh roll of linen. She poured a capful of her precious water into a tin cup and added 2 drops of the acid. "This is how you clean it," she said, her hands moving with the same sureness they used for a seam. "Always away from the cut. Never into it. You must use clean water, or you push the sickness in." He watched her, his black eyes absorbing the technique. He winced as the carbolic stung, but he made no sound. "Your water is medicine," he observed. "It is just clean," she said, wrapping the fresh linen tightly. "Sometimes, that is the best medicine." He nodded. "I will show you." He taught her in return. As they moved south, he paused, pointing not at the trail, but at the things beside it. "This hoofprint is old," he said, brushing the edge. "It is dry. The wind has softened it. This one," he pointed to another, a few feet away, "is new. The sand inside is still dark, still wet." He showed her how to find water, not by sight, but by listening. He stopped her, holding a hand up for silence. She heard nothing but the wind. He pointed. A small, gray bird was flying in a straight, determined line. He knows where the water is. Taza said, "We follow him." They found a seep, a patch of damp rock, and were able to fill her canteen. He was the teacher of the land, and she was the teacher of the body. A strange, silent university was forming between them. The sky turned a bruised, sickly yellow on the second afternoon. A wall of grit approached them, a roiling, brown monster that blotted out the sun. "Storm," Taza said, his voice urgent. He pulled her behind a tall spire of rock. Eliza's first instinct was panic. She clutched Pahana, who had begun to fuss, her small face sensing the change in the air. "Her lungs," Eliza said, her mind racing. "The dust! She cannot breathe this." Taza was already scanning the horizon. "We need shelter." Eliza looked at the baby. "Wait." She ripped a long strip of cloth from her cleanest petticoat, soaked it from the canteen, and tied it loosely over the baby's face, creating a damp, breathable filter. Pahana complained, but Eliza held her close. Taza looked at her, his eyes sharp with approval. "Good. You think—" "The birds," she said, remembering his lesson, "Where are the birds?" He was already looking. He pointed to a flock of sparrows, not flying away, but diving toward a dark break in the rocks 100 yards away. "There." He grabbed her arm and pulled her into a run. The wind hit them just as they reached the cleft, a physical blow that stole her breath. The world outside the narrow opening disappeared in a screaming, brown fog. They huddled in the back of the shallow cave. Pahana was crying, her wails muffled by the cloth and the howl of the storm. They were trapped for hours. The wind shrieked, and fine dust coated everything, to pass the time, to keep her mind from the fear that Hale's men were using this storm to ride. Eliza pulled out the surveyor's map. She smoothed it on her knee in the dim, dusty light. She had seen the main spur line, but now she studied the details. "Taza," she said, pointing. "What are these marks? These small crosses? They are all over the Red Valley." He leaned in, his shoulder brushing hers. He traced the cluster of marks with a finger. "Where they dig," he said, his voice flat. "Test holes," Eliza whispered, the word tasting like ash. "They were not just planning. They have already been there. They have been drilling. Hale's men were protecting them." The map was not a proposal. It was a confirmation. The railroad already knew what was under the sacred land. The invasion was not coming. It had already begun, in secret. The hunt for Taza was not a precaution. It was the final stage of a land grab. The storm passed, leaving the air cold and scoured. They moved on, more cautious now, the knowledge of the map a heavy weight in Eliza's pack. On the third morning, Taza stopped. He was in the middle of a step, his body perfectly still. He sniffed the air. "What is it?" Eliza whispered. "Horse," he said, his voice a low growl. "And tobacco. One man. He is following." Eliza's blood ran cold. Hale. "One of his... the man who wears the yellow scarf?" They left the game trail and scrambled up a rocky incline, hiding in a cluster of boulders that overlooked the path. They waited. Eliza's heart beat a slow, heavy drum. Minutes later, the regulator appeared. He was riding a tall bay horse, his eyes on the ground, the yellow scarf a dirty rag at his throat. He was good, she had to admit. He was following the trail they had made, not the false one Taza had laid. Taza handed Pahana to Eliza. The baby was awake, her dark eyes wide. "Do not make a sound, not one breath," he whispered. Before she could even nod, he was gone. He slipped over the rocks like a lizard, circling behind the man. The regulator passed below them, his horse blowing nervously, sensing something. Taza dropped from an overhang. He landed on the man's back, one arm covering the man's mouth, the other twisting the rifle from his grip. The regulator was pulled from the saddle. It was fast, brutal. and utterly silent. Taza had the man on the ground, his own knife at the regulator's throat. The man's eyes were white with terror, his legs kicking uselessly. Eliza scrambled down the rocks, holding Pahana tight. "Taza!" "No," she said, her voice shaking but loud. Do not kill him!" Taza looked up at her, his face a hard mask of fury, his knee pressing the air from the man's chest. "He follows. He brings the others. He was there when my sister died." "I know," Eliza pleaded, moving closer. "But he is beaten. It is not the way. You kill him. You are what Hale says you are. You are just another killer. Do not do it for him. Do it for Pahana. Let her see a different way." Taza stared at the terrified man, his arm trembling with the need to finish it. The silence stretched, broken only by the man's muffled gasps. Then Taza looked at Eliza, at the child in her arms. He was breathing hard, slowly, painfully. He sheathed his knife. He kept his knee on the man's chest. With his free hand, he took the man's rifle and tossed it far into the canyon. He took the pistol from the man's holster and did the same. Then, he took his knife and cleanly sawed through the leather reins, close to the bit. He cut the man's saddle strings and his canteen strap. He stood and slapped the horse hard on the rump. The animal, freed and frightened, bolted down the trail. Taza looked down at the regulator, who was coughing in the dust. "You will walk home," Taza said, his voice cold. "You will tell Hale that the woman and the child are protected. You will tell him the land is watching you." He turned, grabbed Eliza's arm, and pulled her into a fast, ground-eating walk, not looking back. They left the regulator unharmed, but weaponless and stranded, a good 30 miles from Dry Creek. That night, they found a better shelter, a shallow cave with a pool of clean water. Taza built a small, smokeless fire, a trick of dry wood, an arrangement that baffled her. The tiny flames gave off warmth, but almost no light. Pahana was asleep. The silence between them was different. It was no longer the silence of suspicion, but of a shared, bloody ordeal. "You spoke for that man's life," Taza said, staring into the low flames. "The man with the scarf." "I do not believe in killing," Eliza said, her voice quiet. "I have seen too much of it. My husband, Thomas, he was killed like that, for nothing. He was not a fighter. He was just in the way, caught between two fools who needed to prove they were men." Taza was quiet for a long time. To be in the way is a dangerous thing in this land. The railroad, it sees everything in its way. He looked up. "My sister, Nieda, Pahana's mother, she was strong. She fought them when they came to burn our winter stores. The man with the scarf, he shot her." Eliza closed her eyes. "She did not die." Taza continued, his voice going flat and dead. "Not then. She lived long enough to give me the child. She made me promise. Take her away from the iron," she said. "Take her to the Red Valley. If you cannot, find the one who knows how to heal. Put the child in the hands of a healer." He looked at Eliza, his eyes full of a pain so deep it was an ocean. "I did not find a healer. I found you." "She is safe, Taza," Eliza whispered. "I will keep her safe." She looked at Pahana, sleeping in the basket. The child was stirring. Eliza rummaged in her own bundle and pulled out a small scrap of soft flannel and her needle. She took a pinch of the dried lavender she kept for nerves and stitched it into a tiny pouch. It was simple, quick work. She tied it with a piece of linen thread. She tucked the small pouch inside Pahana's wrappings. "To help her sleep," she whispered. Taza watched her fingers. The needle moved in and out, the firelight catching the steel. "It is all I know how to do," Eliza said, feeling the need to apologize for the smallness of the gesture. Taza reached out, his hand hovering over hers. He did not touch her, but he looked at her hands, at the calluses and needle pricks. "No," he said, his voice soft, almost a revelation. "My sister wove baskets. She wove willow and grass. You sew with thread." He pointed to the sleeping child. "But for her, you sew breath. Your hands sew life back into the body." Eliza looked at her own hands, seeing them for the first time as he did, not as tools of mending, but as tools of creation. In the far distance, so faint it was almost part of the wind, they heard it, the long, lonely cry of the night train, hauling its iron west. It was closer than it had been in Dry Creek. The modern world was following them, keeping pace, its steel heart beating in the dark. The land changed. The high, open plateau gave way to a series of deep, jagged canyons. The rock walls stained a profound, bloody red. It was beautiful, but it was a land of traps. Every shadow could hold an enemy, every ledge, a rifle. They were in the Red Valley, Taza's homeland. But he was more tense than Eliza had ever seen him. He was no longer just guiding. He was hunting for hunters. They were forced to travel in the dry riverbeds, the sand and gravel sucking at Eliza's boots, making her legs burn. Pahana was restless, the heat and the constant, jarring motion making her fuss. Eliza had to stop to feed her, finding what little shade she could under a meager overhang. "They know these canyons," Taza said, his voice low. He was perched on a rock above them, his body a still, brown silhouette against the bright blue sky. "Hale's men. They ride with scouts who have been turned, men who sold their brothers for whiskey and rifles." "How much farther to Shima's camp?" Eliza asked, rebundling Pahana. Her own reserves were low. The jerky was gone, and her canteen was half empty. "Close, another 3 miles. If the pass is clear—" He turned his head, his body rigid. "But it is not clear." Eliza heard it then, the scrape of a metal horseshoe on stone, high up on the canyon rim. It was followed by the small, deadly click of a rifle's hammer being pulled back. "Get down!" Taza yelled, launching himself from the rock. A gunshot cracked, the sound echoing, magnified by the canyon walls, until it sounded like a dozen rifles. The bullet sparked off the rock where Taza had been a second before. He grabbed Eliza, pulling her and the baby behind a meager cluster of boulders. "They have the high ground," he hissed, his face a mask of fury. "They waited for us." Another shot, then a third, from a different position. They were pinned. "How many?" Eliza whispered, her body pressed flat against the hot stone. She shielded Pahana with her own body. 3, maybe 4, Taza said, his eyes scanning the rim. "They are smart. They have us in a crossfire. We cannot go forward. We cannot go back." Eliza's mind was racing. They were trapped in the full, hot sun. The men above could wait them out. They would die of thirst before they died of bullets. She looked at her bundle, at the tools of her trade, needles, thread, iodine. Nothing. Then her hand brushed the small, silver-backed hand mirror she kept in her medicine pouch. "Taza," she said, her voice urgent. She pulled out the mirror. It was no bigger than her palm. "They are watching us. What if we make them look somewhere else?" He looked at her, his eyes uncomprehending. "A signal, a false signal," she explained, her words coming fast. "They think we are just us. What if they think we have friends on the other rim?" She held the mirror, catching the bright sun. A dazzling, square flash of light leapt from her hand. She angled it, playing it across the far canyon wall, a good 200 yards to their left. She flashed it 3 times. Fast, dot, dot, dot. "What are you doing?" Taza hissed. "I am answering them," she said. She flashed it again, twice. Dot, dot. A rifle shot cracked from above, but it was not aimed at them. It was aimed at the opposite rim, where her light had flashed. "He sees it," Eliza whispered, a wild hope rising in her. "Keep doing it," Taza said, a slow, fierce grin spreading across his face. He understood. It was a bluff. A man's voice, faint and angry, drifted down from above. "I see them over there. By the cut, it is a signal. They got more men." "Now," Taza said, He grabbed her bundle. We move while they are looking the wrong way. Stay low. Follow my feet. Do not run. Place your feet. Eliza held Pahana in the crook of one arm, her mirror in the other. She flashed it once more, this time farther down the opposite canyon, drawing their fire. Go. They moved. They did not run, but slid from boulder to boulder, Taza leading her to a place she had not seen, a dark fissure in the canyon wall, almost hidden by a curtain of dead, dry vines. It is a waterway, he said, pulling her inside. It goes up. It was not a path. It was a chimney. A dark, narrow climb that required her to brace her back against one wall and her feet against the other. She had to hand Pahana up to Taza, who had climbed ahead, then find her own purchase. Her wool skirt snagged and tore. Her knuckles were raw and bleeding. The baby was crying, her wails echoing in the tight space. Above them, they heard shouts and more gunfire. The regulators, now completely confused, firing at shadows and sun flashes on the wrong side of the canyon. Finally, Taza pulled her over the last ledge. They were on a high, narrow trail, hidden from the men below. They were safe. Eliza collapsed against the rock, her chest heaving, her arms shaking so badly she could barely hold the child. Taza stood watch, his rifle the one he had taken from the regulator in his hands. He was scanning the back trail. One followed, he said, his voice flat. The one who was closest. He is coming up the rocks. Eliza looked. A man in a dusty blue shirt was climbing, his rifle slung over his back, his attention on the path, not on the ledge above him. Taza raised his rifle. He had a clear shot. He would kill the man before he even saw them. No, Eliza said, finding her breath. Please, not again. We are safe. He is not a threat now. He is always a threat, Taza said, his finger tightening on the trigger. He is a snake. You do not let the snake live. We are not snakes. Taza, she said, standing up, putting herself between him and his shot. We just proved that. We beat them with light, not with bullets. Saving a life is a weapon. 2, it is the one they do not have. Please. He looked at her, his jaw set, the muscle working in his cheek. He was torn. His warrior's instinct demanded the kill. Her plea demanded something harder. He lowered the rifle. At that moment, the man below them slipped. His boot lost its purchase on the smooth rock. He fell, twisting, with a sharp, dry snap. He landed on a ledge about 20 feet below them. His body crumpled, his leg bent at an angle that was sickeningly wrong. He did not move. Taza was on him in a second, dropping down the rocks. Eliza, her heart in her throat, followed more slowly. The man was young, no more than 20. His face was covered in a boyish fuzz, and his eyes were wide with shock and pain. His leg was a ruin of shattered bone. Taza raised his knife. He is dying, Taza said. He is living, Eliza countered, pushing his arm away. And he is in pain. She dropped to her knees beside the boy. Help me. She unrolled her bundle. This was her ground. This was her work. Hold him, she commanded Taza. Do not let him move. She cut away the man's denim trousers. The bone was protruding, white and sharp, from the bloody skin. The man was panting, his face pale. I cannot set it here, she said, her hands assessing, but I can stop the bleeding, and I can bind it. Taza, I need 2 straight, strong sticks, now. While he went, she poured iodine directly into the wound. The boy screamed, a high, thin sound. I know, she soothed, her voice low. I know. It is to save the leg. It is to save your life. Taza returned with 2 pieces of mesquite. She bound the leg, splinting it tightly, her hands working with a speed and precision that made Taza watch in silence. When she was done, the bleeding had stopped. The leg was stable. The boy was weeping, the tears cutting clean paths through the dust on his face. Why, he whispered, you are the accomplice. You are the squaw lover. I am a healer, Eliza said, wiping her hands. And you are a boy with a broken leg. She looked at Taza. We cannot leave him. He will die. Taza was looking at the boy with a strange expression. What is your name? Taza asked. Billy, the boy whimpered. Billy Cross. Billy Cross, Taza said. You work for Hale. Yeah, sir. He pays you well to kill women and children. No, Billy said, his fear giving way to indignation. He pays us to protect the railroad survey. He said you was murderers. He lies? Taza said simply. I know, Billy whispered. He told us. He said we had to have the valley clear. He has a contract. Eliza froze. What contract? With the railroad man, the one from Santa Fe, we got 30 days. We have to clear the valley in 30 days, or the contract is void. He said it did not matter how, just get it done. 30 days. Eliza looked at Taza. The map, the test holes, the ambush, it all snapped into place. It was not a land grab. It was a deadline. We take him, Eliza said. To Shima's camp, Taza was incredulous. We bring a snake into our house. We bring a message, Eliza said, her voice hard. We bring proof. He is worth more alive than dead. He is the proof of Hale's plan. The camp was hidden in a fold of the canyon, a place where the red rock widened into a small, fertile valley, green with cottonwoods and a running stream. Taza carried the boy. Billy slung over his shoulder. Eliza walked beside him, Pahana on her hip. They were met by silence. There were perhaps 50 people. They emerged from wickiup made of brush and hide, but they were not warriors. They were women, old men, and children. It was a refugee camp. Their faces were hard. When they saw Taza, there were murmurs of recognition. But when they saw Eliza, a white woman, carrying a white man's rifle, her face streaked with dirt and her dress torn, their faces closed. The women grabbed their children, pulling them back into the shadows of the lodges. An old woman, her face a beautiful map of wrinkles, stepped forward. She was small, but she moved with an authority that was absolute. She wore a simple hide dress, and her gray hair was bound in 2 braids. This was Shima. Taza stepped forward and spoke, his voice low and rapid in his own language. He gestured to Eliza, to Pahana, to the wounded boy. Shima's eyes, black and as sharp as obsidian, rested on Eliza. She did not look at her with hatred. She looked at her with a profound, weary assessment. Shima walked up to Eliza. She was a full foot shorter, but Eliza felt she was being judged by a giant. Shima did not speak. She raised a weathered hand and pressed it, palm flat, against Eliza's chest, directly over her heart. Eliza stood still, her breath held. The old woman's hand was warm. She felt the frantic, exhausted beat of Eliza's heart. Shima spoke, her voice like stones rolling in a dry creek bed. Her English was clear. You have a strong heart, but it is a white woman's heart. It is afraid. She moved her hand from Eliza's heart to her hands, the ones that clutched her bundle. Taza says these hands know how to sew. But what do they sew? Do they sew lies, or do they sew life? I sew what is torn, Eliza said, her voice unsteady. Shima looked at the wounded regulator, Billy, who Taza had placed on the ground. Then she pointed to a lodge where a young woman sat, weeping. My granddaughter's child is sick. The fever has been on him for 2 days. Go, sew his life back. It was not a request. It was a command, a test. Eliza entered the lodge. The air was hot and close, smelling of fear. The child, a boy of about 4, was on a pallet of furs, his body shaking, his skin burning hot. Eliza opened her bundle. She had no time for doubt. She worked. She sent the mother for cold water from the stream. She crushed the dried willow bark nature's aspirin and mixed it with honey. She forced the bitter paste into the child's mouth. She steeped the wild mint she had gathered. forcing the weak tea between his lips. But the medicine was only part of it. She saw the water buckets in the lodge. They were dirty, the water stagnant. "Where is your water?" she asked the mother. The woman pointed to a pooled, algae-filled eddy in the stream, downstream from the main camp. "No," Eliza said. "That is the sickness." She went back out, found Shima. "Your water is sick. You must boil all water before you drink. You must get it from upstream, where it runs fast. The fever is in the water, not in the air." Shima's eyes widened. She gave a sharp command. The women moved, grabbing their buckets. Eliza went back to the child. She bathed him in cool water, her hands gentle, her voice a low, soothing hum. She sat for 3 hours, not moving, bathing his face, forcing the willow bark tea into him. Taza sat outside the lodge, guarding her, while Billy Cross was tied and guarded elsewhere. Near dusk, the child's shaking stopped. The heat began to recede from his skin. He opened his eyes, and he asked for his mother. Eliza walked out of the lodge, her body an ache of pure exhaustion. Shima was waiting. Eliza simply nodded. The fever broke. He will live. Shima stared at her for a long moment. Then, she gave a single, sharp nod of acceptance. Later that night, Eliza sat by a small fire, Taza beside her. Pahana was asleep in her lap. The baby, sensing the peace, babbled in her sleep. A small, happy sound. Taza, who had been watching his niece, made a low sound in his throat. Eliza looked at him. A single tear was tracing a path down his cheek, visible in the firelight. He did not wipe it away. He was not ashamed. She has her mother's voice," he whispered. Eliza felt her own eyes burn. She looked down at the child, this little girl who had adopted her. She placed her hand on Pahana's head. It was not the ghost of her own child, she felt. It was a new, real, living warmth. She was a mother again, in a way she had never thought possible. Shima approached their fire. "You may stay," the old woman said. "Your hands, they sew with truth, but you are not a guest. The camp has laws. You will work. You will learn." Eliza looked up at her, grateful. "Thank you." "Do not thank me," Shima said, her gaze moving to the shadows where the wounded regulator was being held. "Thank him. He has brought us a message. 30 days. Now we know the name of our enemy. It is not just hail. It is the clock." They had been in the sanctuary of the Red Valley for 5 days. A fragile peace settled over the camp. A breath held in the lungs of the canyon. Eliza had fallen into a routine that was part healer, part prisoner, part guest. She ran the sick lodge with an iron hand, her first act to move the latrines downstream and enforce the boiling of all drinking water. The camp's health improved in 2 days. She tended to Billy Cross, the wounded regulator. He was a boy, she had realized, just a boy caught in Hale's machine. He was terrified of the Apache, but he was more terrified of Eliza's iodine. His leg, against all odds, was healing. The infection had not taken root. He was their captive, but he was also her patient. Taza and the few other men of fighting age were ghosts. They slipped out at dawn and returned at dusk, their faces grim. They scouted, they watched, and they hunted, bringing back 2 deer, which brought a brief, stolen night of feasting. On the morning of the 6th day, a high, thin wail cut through the valley. It was the lookout. A rider appeared from the south, his horse lathered and near collapse. He was Kale, one of the young scouts Taza had posted. He slid from his mount before it even stopped, stumbling to Shima's fire. The camp gathered, a silent, fearful mass. Kale spoke, his words fast and choked in his own tongue. Eliza did not need to understand the words. She saw the look on Taza's face. It was the look of a man who had been expecting the executioner and had just heard his knock. Taza turned to Eliza, his voice low and flat, stripped of all emotion. "Soldiers, many, Not the sheriff's men. They wear the blue coats. Heavy cavalry with a supply wagon. They have found the pass. They will be here by morning." The fire had come. It was not the fast-burning grass fire of the regulators. This was the deep, unstoppable furnace of the United States Army. The time for hiding was over. That morning, before the scouts' arrival, Eliza had climbed the ridge with Taza. He wanted to show her the escape routes, but they had seen something else. On the low, rounded hill to the east, the one Shima had told her was the burial place of the ancestors, a new, ugly scar had been drawn. A line of fresh-cut wooden stakes, trailing small red flags, marched in a perfectly straight line. They ran directly across the highest point of the burial mound. "The map," Eliza had whispered, her blood running cold. She did not need to pull the paper from her pouch. She knew the dotted line, the test holes, and now the survey stakes. The railroad was not just a plan. It was a physical invasion. They were, quite literally, planning to run their tracks through the bones of Taza's family. Now, with the scouts' news, the stakes were no longer a threat. They were a death warrant. That night, Shima called the council. Every adult in the camp gathered around the central fire. The air was thick with the smell of juniper smoke and dread. It began with the elders. An old man, his face like a dried apple, spoke first. "We must run. We will take the high passes into the Dragoon Mountains. We have done it before. The soldiers are slow. Their wagons cannot follow. We will survive. The land remains, even if we are not on it." A growl of dissent rose from the younger men. Cale, his face streaked with the dust of his hard ride, jumped to his feet. "No, I will not run again. This is our land. Those are our graves." He pointed into the darkness, toward the desecrated hill. "We fight. We know the rocks. They do not. We hit them in the pass. We bleed them until they turn back." Taza stood. He had not spoken, but his presence dominated the firelight. "Cale is right, but he is also wrong," Taza said, his voice a low command. "We cannot fight them head-on. That is suicide. But we do not have to. This is our canyon. We can make every rock a fortress. We can make the pass a trap. 10 men, fighting as one, can hold off 100. We will not let them see this valley. We will not let them reach the graves." He was a warrior again. His grief burned away by the cold fire of strategy. Eliza listened, her heart sinking. She looked at the faces. She counted. There were 15 men, perhaps, who could hold a rifle. They were talking about fighting a full company of cavalry. They would be slaughtered. The vision of her husband, bleeding out on a dirty floor, rose in her mind, pointless. She looked at Shima. The old woman had remained silent, her eyes closed, her hands clasped. Finally, Shima spoke. Her voice was not loud, but it cut through the angry muttering like a knife. "And after, nephew," she asked, her eyes opening to fix on Taza, "after you have fought bravely, after you have killed 5 soldiers, and they have killed all of you, what then? The women and children will be left. The soldiers will come. The railroad will build its tracks over your graves, and over the graves of our ancestors. You will have died for honor and lost everything." She turned her gaze to the elders. "And you," she said, "if we run, we survive. Yes, we will hide in the mountains, and we will eat roots, and we will watch from a distance as they tear our home apart. We will live, but we will live as ghosts. We will have lost our souls." The council was silent. There was no good path. Eliza felt the weight of her own body. She was the one who had brought this. She was the accomplice. Her friendship with Taza, her healing of the child, her flight from Dry Creek, it had all led here. She was the stone that had started the avalanche. She looked at the faces, the old, the young, the mothers holding their babies, and she felt the trap close around her. If she said nothing, they would be crushed. If she urged them to fight, she was a murderer. She stepped into the firelight. Her voice trembled. "You are all right," she said. "Running is death. Fighting is death." Cale sneered. "What does the white woman know?" "I know the man who sent them," Eliza said, her voice finding a sudden, cold strength. "I know Sheriff Hale, and I know what he wants. He wants you to fight. He needs a battle. He needs you to be hostiles. A massacre is what he is praying for. It gives him the legal right to clear this valley. It makes him a hero to the railroad." She held up the surveyor's map, the paper glowing in the firelight. "This is not a war. This is a crime. Hale is using the army to enforce a private contract. The soldiers are not here to kill you. They are here to protect this." She pointed to the map. "They are just tools, but their captain, he might not know he is a tool. He might be an honorable man." Shema's eyes were fixed on her. "What are you saying?" "White thread." "You cannot fight the soldiers," Eliza said, "and you cannot run from them. But you can talk to them, or, rather, I can." The silence was profound, broken only by the crackle of the fire. Taza moved to her side. "No, Eliza, they will shoot you on sight. You are with us. You are the accomplice." "I am a white woman," Eliza said, the words heavy and bitter. "They will not shoot a white woman carrying a white flag. They will be confused. They will stop. They will have to listen. Hale wants you to be savages. I will walk in there, and I will be a widow. I will be a nurse. I will show them Billy Cross. I will show them this map. I will tell them about the 30-day contract. I will tell them they are being used to protect a criminal who is desecrating a graveyard for profit." She turned her gaze to Shema. "You need time," she said, her voice passionate. "This is how I get you time. I cannot fight for you, but I can stop the fight. I can sew a stitch into the clock. It is the only thing I know how to do. Let me go." Shema looked at her for a long, unblinking minute. The old woman had seen 100 plans, 100 boasts. She saw the terror in Eliza's eyes, but she also saw the steel beneath it. She gave a single, slow nod. "A thin thread," Shema said, "but it is the only one we have. You will go." Taza grabbed her arm. "I forbid it." "You cannot," Eliza said, not pulling away. "This is my choice. You chose to fight. I choose to talk. It is the same as your choice. Taza, it is the only weapon I have." He looked at her, his face a storm of fury and fear. He saw her resolve. He saw that she was not a woman to be protected. She was a woman who was protecting in her own way. He slowly, agonizingly, released his grip. He respected her, and it was killing him. The council was over. It was decided. Eliza would leave before dawn. She went to the lodge to prepare. There was nothing to prepare. She would take the map. She would take her mother's journal. She would leave her medicines, her needles, her thread. She would leave them with Shema. Taza entered the lodge, a shadow blocking the door. Pahana was asleep in her arms, bundled against the night. He did not speak. He just stood there, watching her. Then he stepped forward. He held out his hand. On his palm was a knife. It was not steel. It was a long, pale, curving piece of bone, sharpened to a lethal point. The handle was wrapped in old, dark sinew. It was a woman's knife, a tool for skinning and cutting, but it was also a weapon. "This was my sister's," Taza said, his voice thick. "Niida. She made it. It was her hand." Eliza looked at it, uncomprehending. "In our way, we do not give such things," he said. "They are part of us. They are buried with us. But my sister, she told me to find the hands of a healer." He pushed the knife into her hand, wrapping her fingers around the worn handle. "It belongs to you. You are her sister now. You are family." Eliza's throat closed. She could not speak. The bone was warm, as if it still held Nida's life. "I will be on the ridge," Taza said, his voice rough. "When you walk, I will be watching. If they harm you, They will not, Eliza said, trying to believe it. If the words fail, he said, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper, his eyes burning into hers. You use this. Do not let them take you to hell. Do not let them take you alive. This is my promise, and it is yours. He was giving her a tool to save her life, and he was giving her a tool to take it. The terrible, loving, brutal trust of it broke her heart. I will keep it, she whispered. She tucked the bone knife into the waistband of her skirt, hiding it beneath the folds of cloth. She looked at Pahana, her face peaceful in sleep. Eliza leaned down and kissed the child's forehead, breathing in the smell of her hair, the faint scent of wood smoke and sweet milk. She felt a tear, hot and sharp, escape and land on the baby's cheek. Taza put his hand on her shoulder. She straightened up. She handed Pahana to him. The child, warm and heavy, passed from her arms to his. For a moment, they stood there, the child a bridge between them. Then Taza shifted Pahana to one arm and pulled Eliza to him. It was not a gentle embrace. It was a desperate, crushing hug, his arms locking around her, pulling her so tight against his chest she could not breathe. He buried his face in her hair, his body trembling with a warrior's suppressed violence. He was not just holding her. He was trying to pour his own strength into her, to shield her with his own body. Eliza wrapped her arms around him, her hands gripping the rough hide of his tunic. She held on, feeling the solid, living beat of his heart against her cheek. He smelled of pine smoke in the cold night air. He was her ally. He was her family. He let her go, his hands lingering on her arms as if to memorize her. The son is not yet born, he said. Go now, and sew your stitch. White thread, sew it strong. Eliza looked at him, at the child in his arms. She gave him one last, burning look. Then she turned and walked out of the lodge, into the cold, gray dark, her hands empty, save for a torn piece of white linen she would tie to a stick. The decision had been made. The council fire had burned down to embers, and the camp had fallen into a tense, waiting silence. Eliza had gone back to her lodge, ostensibly to gather her few things, but there was nothing to gather, only a map and a journal. The rain began just after midnight. It was not a storm, just a soft, persistent patter on the taut hide of the wickiup, a sound like 1,000 quiet heartbeats. Taza entered, a shadow against the dark. He did not ask permission. He belonged here. He carried Pahana, who was fast asleep, and laid her in the mending basket cot, covering her with a soft rabbit fur. He did not light a fire. They sat in the dark, listening to the rain. The air was close, warm, and electric with everything unsaid. You should sleep, he said. His voice was a low rumble, blending with the sound of the rain. You are not sleeping, she replied. She was sitting on her bedding, her back against the lodge's frame. Her hands were in her lap, restless. He sat on the ground a few feet from her, his back against the opposite wall. For a long time, they just breathed, occupying the small, dark space. My hands are shaking, Eliza said into the darkness. I am not a coward. I have seen men die, but my hands are shaking. Your hands are wise, Taza said. They know what the rest of you is pretending not to, that this is a fool's path. Is it? It is the only path. That does not make it less foolish. He shifted, his knee brushing the packed earth. We should be preparing. He reached for a bundle of yucca fiber and a small pot of pine resin he had brought in earlier, to waterproof new canteens. He began working, his fingers strong and sure, pulling and twisting the fibers into a tight, strong cord. Eliza watched him. She needed to do something, or her nerves would unravel. She moved, sitting opposite him, and took a handful of the fiber. Show me, she said. He showed her how to twist, how to feed the new fibers in, how to keep the tension. Their hands worked together. the sticky, sharp scent of the pine resin filling the air. It was a simple, repetitive task, a small piece of order in the chaos. Their fingers brushed. His hands were calloused and scarred, a map of a life she could barely imagine. Yet they were surprisingly gentle as he guided her. "Your hands learn fast," he said. "They are all I have," she whispered. He stopped his work. He looked at her, his face visible in the deep shadow, his eyes catching what little light there was. He reached out and took her hands. He did not just take them, he captured them. He held them, palms up, in his own. His were warm and sticky with the resin, binding them together. He studied them, his gaze intense. He touched the pads of her fingers, tracing the small, hard calluses from her needle, the silver scar on her thumb from a slipped shear. He touched them not with desire, but with a kind of reverence, a profound and searching awe. "So small," he said, his voice thick, "so small, to hold so much life." He turned her hands over and pressed his lips to her right palm. A kiss that was not a kiss, but an oath. It was a searing, dry heat against her skin. "Your hands," he whispered, his voice rough, his breath warm on her skin, "deserve more than sewing." He looked up, his eyes locking on hers. "They deserve to treat me like no other woman alive." Eliza's heart stopped. The world narrowed to the space between them, to the smell of pine and rain and the impossible, binding heat of his touch. He was not speaking of lust. He was speaking of a future. He was offering a life, a place, a meaning that went beyond mending shirts and binding wounds. He was offering to be mended, to be bound, by her. She pulled her hands back, a sharp, involuntary motion. "Taza, do not!" "I have said it." "I cannot," she said, her voice shaking, all her carefully built walls crumbling. "I cannot, I am not what you think. I am a coward. You do not know. I am more afraid of this feeling than I am of the soldiers. I am more afraid of you than I am of Sheriff Hale." "Why?" he asked, his voice softening. "Because the soldiers can only kill me," she whispered, the confession tearing out of her. You make me want to live, and I do not know how to do that anymore. I buried that part of me with Thomas. If I let it come back, if I let you in, and you die in that canyon, I will not survive it. It will break me. It will be the end of me." He watched her, his face full of a deep, aching understanding. He did not try to touch her again. He gave her the one thing she needed. "I will not die," he said simply, as if stating a fact. "But this is not a cage. I am not Hale. I am not your dead husband. What is between us? It is not a rope." He paused, searching for the word. "Freedom. Freedom is giving each other the space to walk. You are free. I am free. We are just walking in the same direction. That is all." He gave her back her strength, her choice. He was not demanding, not taking. He was offering. He reached for a small pouch at his belt. "I made this for you. After the mirror, after the canyon." He held it out. It was a thin leather thong, and on it were tied 2 feathers, a small, bright bluebird feather, and the sharp, barred feather of a hawk. "For the sky," he said, "and for the clear eye." She took it. Her hands were steady now. She put it on. The leather was cool against her skin, a sign of his protection, his respect. "I have something for you, too," she said. She pulled from her own pouch the small amulet she had made, the one with the lavender, but she had been adding to it. She had unstitched it and sewn a new object inside a small, flat, mother-of-pearl button from her wedding dress. She held it out to him. It is not much." He took the small cloth pouch, his large fingers gentle. He did not ask what was inside. He understood the exchange, a piece of her life, for a piece of his. He tied it securely to the sinew on his knife sheath. A blue feather for her, a white button for him. Two worlds, sewn together. He looked at her, and the space between them was no longer empty. It was full. "When you walk to them," he said, his voice quiet, "you will not be alone. My heart will be with you." "And mine with you," she whispered. He held up his hand. She mirrored him. Slowly, they placed their palms flat on each other's chests. She felt the strong, steady beat of his heart under her hand. He felt the fast, sparrow-wing beat of hers. It was not a lover's touch. It was a soldier's promise, a pact. "I will not betray you. I will not let you fall." They sat like that until the rain stopped, and the first cold gray light of dawn began to creep into the lodge. The time had come. The camp was silent as she walked to the mule Shima had provided. It was a small, bony creature, but its eyes were patient. Taza walked beside her, carrying Pahana, who was awake now, her dark eyes watching everything. Eliza mounted the mule. She felt high up, exposed. She looked down at Taza. He held Pahana up to her. Eliza kissed the baby's forehead, a long, final press of her lips. "Be safe, little son," she whispered. She turned to Taza. There were no more words. They had said everything in the dark. He just looked at her, his face carved from the red stone of the canyon, his eyes burning. He stepped back. He turned to Kale and the 3 other scouts. "You know the path. You will be my eyes. If a single shot is fired before my word, I will kill you myself. We follow Shima's law. We do not shoot first." Eliza tied the piece of white linen to a stick of mesquite. She held it high. She looked once at the small figure of Taza, holding his niece, watching her. The memory of her husband's pointless death flashed in her mind. This was not the same. This was not a brawl. This was a choice. This was not a cycle of hatred she was repeating. It was one she was trying to break. She kicked the mule's sides. The animal moved forward, its hooves making small, crunching sounds in the damp gravel. The dawn was as cold and sharp as a blade. She rode out of the hidden valley, alone, toward the mouth of the canyon, toward the waiting guns of the United States Army. The mouth of the canyon was a cold, gray slit. Eliza guided the mule out of the deep red shadows and into the pale, open light of the plain. The camp of the United States Cavalry was less than half a mile distant. It was larger than she had feared. Not a simple patrol, but a full company, encamped in perfect, terrible order. Tents in neat rows, a taut picket line for the horses, a supply wagon. The blue of their uniforms was a stark, unnatural color against the muted greens and browns of the desert. Her white flag, the strip of her petticoat tied to the mesquite branch, felt small and absurd. She heard the shout, sharp and clear on the cold air. "Rider approaching, halt, halt, I say." A sentry raised his rifle. Eliza kept the mule at a slow, steady walk. She held the flag higher. Her heart was a cold, hard knot in her chest, but her hand was steady. She could feel the weight of the bone knife against her waist and the heavier weight of the pepper box in her apron pocket. Soldiers emerged from the tents, their rifles coming up. They formed a loose line, a wall of blue and steel. An officer stepped forward. He was a tall man, in his 40s perhaps, with a face worn by sun and authority. He had the eyes of a man who was tired of the killing. This must be Captain Merritt. "Ma'am," he called out, his voice a mix of confusion and command. "What in God's name are you doing? Identify yourself." Eliza stopped the mule a good 50 feet from the line. "My name is Eliza Whitlow. I am a resident of Dry Creek. I must speak to the commanding officer." Before Merritt could reply, a second figure pushed through the line of soldiers, a big man, wearing a duster and a badge, Sheriff Carter Hale. His presence here, at the head of the column, confirmed every lie. "Well, I will be damned," Hale's voice boomed, a false, hearty sound that dripped malice. He strode forward, his hands on his hips. "It is her, Mrs. Whitlow." We have been scouring the territory for you. He turned to Captain Merritt. Sir, this is the woman I told you about. This is the unknown female accomplice. She has been aiding the hostile Taza. Eliza ignored him. She fixed her gaze on the captain, seeing the integrity in his weary face. Captain Merritt, I am here to stop you from making a terrible mistake. I am here to prevent a massacre. Merritt's brow furrowed. He was a man of orders, and this was not in any manual. Ma'am, those are strong words. We are under territorial orders to pacify this sector. We have sworn reports of hostile Apache, led by the murderer Taza, attacking railroad surveyors and running off stock. You have sworn lies. Captain, Eliza said, her voice clear and carrying. The man standing next to you is not just the law. He is a criminal, and you are not on a military mission. You are here as his private army. Hale's face turned a dull, angry red. Why, you... Captain, this woman is a traitor. She is speaking treason. Am I? Eliza reached into her pocket, not for the pistol, but for the map. I have proof. This, she held it high, is the railroad's private survey map. I ask you to look at it. She dismounted, her legs shaking, but she did not let it show. She walked forward, holding the map. The soldiers tensed, their rifles pointing at her. Hold your fire, Merritt commanded. He met her halfway. She handed him the paper. He unrolled it. He was a military man. He understood the lines and elevations instantly. Now, Captain, Eliza said, pointing to the east, where the sun was just cresting the canyon rim. Look at that low hill, the one the sun is touching, through your field glasses, if you please. Merritt raised his binoculars. He was silent for a long moment. His shoulders stiffened. You will see a line of fresh-cut wooden stakes, Eliza said, her voice a surgeon's, precise and cold, red flags. They match the proposed spur on that map. Do you know what that hill is? Captain, it is an Apache burial ground, a sacred site. The surveyors you were sent to avenge were not attacked. They were desecrating a graveyard. Merritt lowered the glasses, his face grim. Sheriff Hale, you neglected to mention this. It is just a hill Hale spat. It is dirt that is railroad land. This woman is addled. She has been with the savages so long she talks like them. And the savages, Captain Eliza pressed, her gaze locked on Merritt. The ones you are here to pacify. They are in a small camp 2 miles up that canyon. It is not a war party. It is 50 people, old men, women, and children. It is a refugee camp. I am their nurse. If you give the order to advance, your men will not be fighting warriors. They will be slaughtering families. She let the words hang. When the newspapers in Santa Fe get hold of this, when they learn that the United States cavalry was used to kill civilians so a copper mine could dig up a graveyard, there will be a federal investigation. Your commission, sir, will be the first thing to burn. This is a bluff, Hale insisted, but there was a tremor of panic in his voice. This is protected land. Captain, Eliza said, inventing the law as she went, praying it sounded true. There is an old treaty. Sheriff Hale knows this, but he does not care about the treaty because he is a stockholder in the transcontinental copper mine. He is not just upholding the law, he is clearing his investment. She reached into her pocket again. She pulled out the other small, crumpled paper, the one she had found in the surveyor's coat with the map. This is a note from the railroad foreman to the sheriff. It mentions a 30-day window to clear the trouble. 30 days. Captain, does that sound like a military objective? Or a commercial deadline? Merritt's face was like granite. He looked at Hale. Sheriff, you have put my command in a deeply compromised position. To hell with this, Hale roared. He had lost. His scheme was unraveling in the morning sun. I am the law here, and I am ordering you to arrest this woman. He motioned to his 2 regulators, who had followed him. Arrest her. She is an accomplice. The 2 men stepped forward to grab the mule's reins. At that exact instant, a new sound began. It was not a gunshot. It was a strange, rhythmic clattering from the high canyon walls, a hollow, wooden clack, 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 clack that echoed, building in speed. "What in the—" a soldier started to say. Eliza knew. It was Taza. He was not attacking. He was diverting. The soldiers looked up, their rifles turning toward the cliffs. The sound was alien, deeply unsettling. It sounded, as it echoed, like 1,000 diamondback rattlesnakes. The cavalry horses on the picket line heard it. They tossed their heads, their eyes rolling white. The sound grew louder, more frantic. The horses screamed. One pulled its tether, then another. The panic was infectious. The entire line broke. Stampede, a sergeant yelled. The camp dissolved. 40 horses, screaming in terror, thundered through the neat rows of tents. Men dove for cover. A cooking fire was scattered, sending embers and smoke into the air. It was pure, terrifying chaos, without a single shot fired. In the midst of the pandemonium, a young private, his face white, ran up to Captain Merritt. He had been guarding the supply wagon. Sir Captain, the private yelled over the noise. "That woman! She is telling the truth! The 30-day contract! It is true." Merritt grabbed the man's arm. "What did you say, private?" We picked up one of Hale's men on the trail yesterday. Sir, the one who was disarmed. He was delirious. He told us. He said Sheriff Hale gave them a 30-day contract. To clear the valley. He said it did not matter how. Those were his words. Sir, it did not matter how. The proof, the map, the stakes, the diversion, and now, the testimony. Merritt's face hardened. He was a soldier, not a murderer. He turned to Hale, who was standing, stunned, in the middle of the chaos. "Sheriff Hale," Merritt's voice was like ice, cutting through the noise. "You have deliberately misrepresented a commercial dispute as a military threat. You have endangered my command and compromised my orders." You yellow-bellied coward," Hale shrieked, his face purple, his entire fortune and reputation collapsing around him. "You are letting her win. I will not let you." He snapped. His hand went to his holster. He drew his revolver. He did not aim at Merritt. He aimed at Eliza. She was the one. She had done this. "If you will not shut her up," he screamed, and he cocked the hammer. It happened in the sliver of a second between heartbeats. Eliza's hand, which had been resting in her apron pocket, came up. She was holding the pepper box. She did not wait. She did not aim to kill. She aimed to stop. She fired. The small pistol's crack was almost lost in the noise of the horses, but the shot was perfect. The lead ball struck the steel of Hale's revolver. The gun was ripped from his hand, spinning through the air, clattering onto the rocks. A sudden, shocked silence fell. The last of the horses disappeared down the canyon. Sheriff Carter Hale stood there, his hand empty, his mouth open, his eyes wide with disbelief. He had been disarmed by a seamstress in front of a full company of cavalry. The humiliation was total. Eliza kept the small, smoking pistol level, her hand rock steady. "I am a nurse, Sheriff," she said, her voice ringing in the cold, clear air. "I do not like to kill, but I will stop a sickness when I see one." Captain Merritt was the first to move. He drew his own sidearm and aimed it, not at Eliza, but at Hale. Sergeant Merritt barked, "Arrest this man. Confine him to the supply wagon. He is under arrest for inciting a military conflict under false pretenses." 2 soldiers, their faces grim, grabbed Hale, who was sputtering, wordless with rage. Merritt turned to his company, his voice a full-throated command. "The advance is halted, Sergeant. Secure the ammunition boxes. No man fires a shot. I want a rider ready. You will ride to the telegraph line at Fort Wingate. You will send this message, Governor, awaiting clarification of orders. Facing civilian population, not hostiles. Local constabulary. Sheriff Hale, compromised by commercial interests, requesting immediate investigation. Sign it, Captain Merritt, 3rd Cavalry. He holstered his pistol. He had given them time. He had sewn the stitch. Merritt looked at Eliza. His face was etched with a new, deep exhaustion. "Mrs. Whitlow, I believe you. Every word." He sighed. "But you are, by your own admission, allied with the Apache, and you have just fired a weapon at an officer of the law. I cannot, in good conscience, let you ride back into that canyon. For the integrity of this investigation, and frankly, for your own safety, I must place you in protective custody." Eliza nodded. She understood the cost. She lowered the pepper box and offered it to him. "But first—" "I am sorry for this, ma'am," Merritt said, taking the small pistol. He pulled a pair of iron handcuffs from his belt. "I am not, Captain," Eliza said. He fastened the cold steel around her wrists. The metal was light. She had traded her own freedom for the lives of the camp. She sat on the mule, her hands bound, and watched as the soldiers locked the green ammunition chests. The sun was fully up, and it was a beautiful, clear morning. The day bled into a long, hot afternoon. Captain Merritt had assigned Eliza to a small, empty supply tent near the center of the camp. It was an imprisonment, but it was not a cruel one. He had given her a canteen of fresh water and a plate of hardtack and beans. Her cuffed hands made eating a clumsy, humiliating affair. 2 guards were posted outside her tent flap. She could hear the sounds of the camp, the subdued orders of the sergeant, the jingle of harness as men rounded up the last of the scattered horses, the low, angry murmur of Sheriff Hale, who was confined to the supply wagon, his voice a muffled, impotent rage. Eliza sat on a stack of folded canvases, her mind a blank wall of exhaustion. She had done her part. The rest was out of her hands. She thought of Taza, imagining him on the high ridge, watching, his heart a cold knot of fury. She had never felt so alone. As the sun began to set, painting the desert in shades of gold and violet, Captain Merritt entered the tent. He looked, she thought, 100 years old. "Mrs. Whitlow," he said, his voice low. He set a small lantern on a crate, filling the tent with a warm, flickering light. "My rider is on his way to Fort Wingate. We should have a reply by tomorrow evening. Until then, you will be safe here." "And the camp in the canyon?" she asked, her voice hoarse. "My orders are to hold this position. I will not advance," he said. "You have my word. I have also retrieved this for you." He placed her mother's leather-bound journal on the crate. Her medicines, her pepper box, her map, all her tools of war were gone. But he had brought her this, her journal of healing. It was a gesture of profound respect. "Thank you, Captain," she whispered. He was silent for a moment. He unbuckled his heavy belt, which held his sidearm, a flask, and a small ring of iron keys. He rubbed his face, a gesture of deep weariness. "I have spent 20 years on the frontier. Ma'am, I have fought in battles that I believed were just today. Today I am not certain I am on the right side of God's law." He hung his belt on a tent pole. The ring of keys dangled, catching the light. One of them was small and gray, the key to her cuffs. "I am going to the command tent to review the dispatches," he said, his voice flat. He pointedly looked away from his belt. "The guards outside have their orders. They are not to enter, and you are not to leave. Good evening." He left, pulling the tent flap closed. Eliza stared at the keys. He had left them. He had left them in a way that gave him perfect deniability. He had not freed her. He had simply been careless. The man of conscience was still alive. She waited. 1 hour, 2. The camp sounds changed. The murmur of men preparing for sleep. The changing of the guard, their footsteps heavy and predictable. Then, a new sound. From the far side of the camp, away from the canyon, came a flash of light, a quick, bright pulse against the dark rock wall. Once, twice, Then again, it was Taza. He was using her own trick. He was drawing their eyes. What was that she heard a guard shout? Looked like lightning from the ground. Get the sergeant? As the men's attention was pulled east, a second, stranger sound began. It came from the west, from the direction of the canyon mouth. It was a low, thin, reedy wail, the sound of a bone flute, playing a song that was all air and shadow. It was the saddest, most unsettling sound Eliza had ever heard. The horses, already spooked from the morning, began to whicker and stamp. The guards were now hopelessly distracted, caught between a silent, flashing light and a wailing, invisible ghost. What is that noise? Make it stop. This was her moment. Eliza moved. She grabbed the keys, her cuffed hands fumbling. The small, gray key slid into the lock. A sharp click. The steel fell from her left wrist. Another click. She was free. She rubbed her wrists, her hands shaking, and grabbed her journal, stuffing it into the bodice of her dress. She crept to the back of the supply tent. Nita's bone knife was still in her waistband. She used its sharp, strong point to slit the canvas, cutting a long, silent opening into the night. Just as she was about to slip out, a new commotion began at the front of the camp. A woman's voice, wailing, not a cry of fear, but of profound, theatrical grief. Please help me, I am lost, my son. He is gone, the rocks. Help me. It was Shima. The old woman had walked directly into the camp, her arms outstretched, her face a mask of terror and confusion. She was no longer an elder. She was a lost, pathetic old woman. She stumbled toward the main fire and collapsed, her wails rising. It was a masterstroke. The soldiers, trained to fight warriors, were helpless against this. They gathered around, their rifles lowered, their faces a mix of pity and frustration. Get her some water. Where did she come from? Captain, we have a civilian. Merritt, his face a thundercloud, was running toward the new problem. The entire camp's attention, from the captain to the lowest private, was fixed on Shima, who was now coughing and pretending to faint. Eliza did not wait. She slid through the cut in the canvas and disappeared into the shadows. She ran, her feet finding the soft sand, her body bent low. She ran toward the sound of the flute. She moved through the darkness, her breath tearing at her lungs, until she reached the deep shadows of the canyon mouth. A hand, hard and warm, grabbed her arm and pulled her behind a boulder. You are safe, Taza whispered. His voice was thick. She could not speak. She fell against him, her body trembling with the release of a day's worth of terror. He did not embrace her as he had the night before. He just held her upright, his hands on her arms, his strength pouring into her. She could feel his own body shaking. Not from fear, from relief. Shima Eliza finally gasped. She is a fox, Taza said, a rare note of humor in his voice. She will grieve and wail until they are so tired of her they give her a blanket and point her home. She is safe, but we must go. Wait, Eliza said. She pulled the journal from her dress. She also had the map and the small, crumpled note from the foreman. Merritt had not found them. Hale is arrested, but the railroad is not. They will just send another man. We have to warn the governor. We have to send the proof. Santa Fe is a week's ride, Taza said. I know a man, Eliza said, her mind working fast. Miguel, the freighter, the one whose son I saved from the fever. He lives on the old high road. He is Mexican. He is not part of this. Hale's men will not stop him. He owes me a life. Taza nodded. He understood. I know his trading post. It is a day's ride. Take this, she said, pressing the map and the note into his hand. Take the mule. Tell him what happened. Tell him to ride for Santa Fe. Tell him Eliza Whitlow asks him to repay the debt. And you, he asked. I am going back to the camp. They need me. Pahana needs me. He gripped the papers. This was the final move. I will go. I will be back by tomorrow night." He pulled her into a quick, hard hug, his lips brushing the top of her head. "White thread, you are brave." He was gone. Eliza made her way back to the canyon alone. When the first light of dawn touched the high ridges, she walked into the hidden valley. The camp was waiting. They had been standing at the entrance, a silent, fearful crowd, all night, when they saw her, alone, walking. A great, collective sigh went up. The women ran to her, touching her, their faces wet with tears. The news spread as Taza returned, silent and exhausted. The following night, the soldiers were not advancing. Hale was a prisoner. The immediate danger was past. The mood of the camp changed. The brittle, fatalistic fear was replaced by something new, something tough and green. It was hope. Shima, who had returned in the middle of the night with a new blanket and a full canteen, gave the orders. "The time for hiding is done," she declared, her voice strong. "The time for living has begun. We will not run. We will plant. Kale, take the men. We will dig a new ditch from the stream. We will water the fallow ground. The women will take the seed corn. It is late, but we will plant. We will show this land that we are still here." The camp began to work. The sound of digging, of children laughing, of women singing as they sorted the corn, filled the valley. They were choosing to have a future. That evening, the camp gathered. Shima called Eliza to the fire. "The white woman came to us as a refugee," Shima announced, her voice carrying in the still air. "She asked for shelter, but she did not take. She brought our health back. She walked into the soldiers' camp. She faced the man with the snake's tongue. She did not use a warrior's arrow. She used a healer's words. She did not break the thread of life. She sewed it stronger." Shima placed her hands on Eliza's head. "We gave her a name, White Thread. Now, it is her true name. She is no longer Eliza Whitlow of Dry Creek. She is White Thread of the Red Valley. She is one of us." A cheer went up, a sound of pure, sudden joy. The next day was a day of cleansing. The entire camp walked to the burial mound on the hill. In silence, they pulled the red-flagged surveyor's stakes from the sacred earth. They piled the offensive wooden markers in a heap and set them on fire, the smoke rising black against the blue sky. They prayed. Shima led them in a song of thanks, of washing the land clean of the insult. Eliza stood with Taza, watching the flames. He held Pahana, who was watching the smoke with wide, curious eyes. When the ceremony was over, Taza did not leave. He took Neida's bone knife from Eliza's belt. He walked to the largest, flattest boulder on the crest of the hill, the one that faced the rising sun. He knelt. He began to carve. He worked for hours, the scrape of bone on stone a quiet, steady rhythm. Eliza watched. He was not just carving. He was praying. He was recording their history. He carved a perfect, outstretched hand, with long, slender fingers. Beside it, he carved a needle, its eye open, and above them both, he carved a small, bright, rising sun. The hand that heals, the needle that stitches, the new life. When he was done, he stood back. His face was at peace. He looked at Eliza, and she knew this was her place. This was her family. That night, the three of them sat outside their lodge. The air was cool, and the sound of crickets filled the valley. Pahana slept in her basket. Taza was cleaning his rifle. Eliza was mending a tear in his tunic, her fingers working the familiar stitch. They did not speak. They did not need to. The silence was full and comfortable. The war was not over. The railroad was still out there. But they had won. They had earned this quiet. They had earned this night. The silence of the canyon held its breath for 4 days. In the small, hidden valley, life began to push against the fear. The women, led by Shima, cleared new ground for a late planting of corn. The men, led by Taza, dug a new irrigation ditch, the sound of their tools a rhythm of defiance. Eliza, now known only as White Thread, kept her clinic. She tended the sick, and she tended the young regulator, Billy Cross, whose fever had broken and whose leg was beginning to mend. The blue-coated soldiers remained on the plain, a distant, static line, but they did not advance. On the 5th day, Miguel the freighter appeared. He did not ride into the camp. He met Taza at the mouth of the canyon. As arranged, he brought sugar, salt, and news from Santa Fe. The news was a clean, sharp wind blowing the sickness away. Captain Merritt's message, combined with the map and the note delivered by Miguel, had detonated in the governor's office. The investigation was swift and brutal. The railroad, terrified of a federal inquiry, immediately suspended its contract and denied all knowledge of the 30-day deadline. Sheriff Carter Hale, facing the combined testimony of a cavalry captain and the railroad's own internal letters, was finished. He was not just suspended. He was under arrest, indicted on charges of conspiracy and the misuse of military authority. He was in irons, on his way to the territorial prison. Captain Merritt had new orders. He was to re-examine the territorial boundaries. Using the old treaty maps, he was commanded to establish a temporary military buffer zone, 5 miles east of the Red Valley, ensuring the graves of the ancestors were protected. The next morning, the blue-coated soldiers struck their tents, packed their wagons, and marched away. They were still out there, a reminder of the other world. But the siege was broken. The valley exhaled. The immediate, suffocating threat was gone. But the long, slow work of healing had just begun. Eliza's small lodge became the center of the camp. It was a clinic, but it became more. The mothers who brought their children for her willow bark tea or comfrey salves would linger, watching her. They saw her read from the leather journal of her mother, her fingers tracing the English words. They were curious. Eliza began to teach. She drew letters in the smooth, packed earth of the lodge floor. She taught them the sounds A, B, C. She taught them the words water, corn, fever, treaty. She was not just mending bodies. She was giving them the tools to mend their own future, to understand the language of the men who wrote the laws. Taza, too, found a new path. The victory had changed him. He had seen Eliza walk into the camp, armed only with light and paper. He had seen the power of restraint. The younger men, like Cale, were still hot-blooded. They wanted to celebrate by raiding the empty railroad camps. Taza gathered them. He took them into the high mountains, but he did not teach them war. He taught them to hunt, to track, to read the signs of the land. He taught them to survive, but he also taught them the harder lesson, the one he had learned from her. He taught them when to keep the knife in its sheath. The man who fights because he is angry loses. Taza told them, his voice quiet as he skinned a deer. The man who fights to protect, who knows when to wait, he is the one who endures. He was not training warriors. He was raising guardians. And in the heart of this new world, Pahana grew. She was walking, a strong, determined child who moved between the two cultures as if there were no line. She was the child of the valley, held by all, fed by many. But she always returned to the lodge of White Thread. She would sit on the floor, playing with the empty wooden spools that Eliza kept, stacking them into small, crooked towers. Her first words were a perfect, simple blend. When she was thirsty, she pointed to the stream and said, "Ma, agua." When she was hungry, she held up her hands and demanded corn. Her name for Taza was Uncle, a sound of pure, bright joy. But her word for Eliza, the first one she had spoken, the one that had stopped Eliza's heart, was Ma, Mother. It was a title that needed no license, no paper, no law. It was a fact, as real as the red earth beneath their feet. The bond, forged in a storm and sealed with a promise, was the truest thing in Eliza's life. The world outside did not disappear. The railroad was still coming. a vast iron glacier, far in the distance. When the wind was right, they could still hear the faint, lonely whistle of the 815, the heartbeat of the new age. But it was a heart that had been forced to beat in a different rhythm. The new survey line, the one Captain Merritt had drawn, bent wide around the valley. It did not cross the burial mounds. It did not tear open the graves. A new, thin thread of connection began. Miguel, the freighter, established a regular route. He brought coffee, sugar, and steel needles. He traded them for the tough, beautiful baskets the Chiricahua women wove, and for the dried deer meat from the hunters of Taza. He brought news from Dry Creek, of a new, quieter sheriff, and of a town adjusting to the fact that its richest men were not always its best. The Red Valley was no longer just a hidden refuge. It was a home. It was a place on the map, a place that had earned its right to exist. That winter, as the snows dusted the high ridges, Eliza began a new project. She had Shima and Miguel trade for scraps of cloth, a piece of blue cavalry wool, a strip of gray linen from a stagecoach driver, a square of red flannel, like the kind the Apache women wore, a piece of her own torn cotton dress, a patch of the heavy canvas tarp she had been mending that first night. Her needle, sharp and bright, moved in the firelight. She was making a quilt. It was not a tidy, repeating pattern of flowers or stars. It was a map. It was her history, a patch of her old life sewn directly to a patch of her new one, a square of soldier's blue next to a piece of Taza's discarded buckskin. She was not erasing the scars of the territory. She was not hiding the tears. She was doing what she had always done. She was taking the torn, frayed edges from both sides of the divide, and she was stitching them together. She was making them strong. She was making them warm. Every night, she would wrap Pahana in the growing quilt. The child, safe and warm, would fall asleep, her small hand clutching the smooth pearl button Eliza now wore on the leather thong around her neck. Eliza would lean down, her lips brushing the dark, fine hair of the child, and she would whisper the same words, a promise to Pahana, and a reminder to herself, "You are not alone." She had been a woman locked in a room, a widow defined by what she had lost. Now, she was Ma. She was white thread. She was not alone. Taza entered the lodge, silent as the snow falling outside. He stood for a long time, watching her. He did not watch her face. He watched her hands. He watched the needle rise and fall, pulling the blue wool and the red flannel into a single, strong seam. He sat beside her, the scent of pine and cold air clinging to him. He reached out, his fingers tracing the line of her stitches, the place where two worlds met. He looked from the quilt to her hands. He saw the calluses from the needle, the faint scar from the shears, the strength that had held a child, aimed a pistol, and healed a valley. "We are still here," he said, his voice low, a sound of wonder. "Hale is in prison. The soldiers are gone. The railroad. It is only a sound in the wind." He looked at her, his eyes reflecting the firelight. "Your hands," he said, his voice rough with an emotion he could not name. "They have sown a different west." Eliza looked up, at his face, at the sleeping child, at the work in her lap. She had found her answer. A needle was not helpless against the iron of the world. It was simply a different kind of power. Outside, the wind moved through the high cottonwoods, the same dry, wild wind that had once rattled her lonely window. It no longer sounded like a threat. It sounded like the land breathing. The West was still a hard country. It was still a place of grit and distance, of sudden loss and difficult choices. But it was, she knew, livable. It was a place where a home could be made, where a child could be safe. It was a place where a future was possible. It was livable, when someone was brave enough to stop the bleeding, to face the fire, and to sew the torn edges back together. Thank you so much for listening to this story. I truly hope it touched your heart. I would be honored if you would leave a comment below and let me know where you are listening from. It is always a pleasure to see how far these tales travel. Please subscribe to my channel, Wild West Tales, and like this video. It helps these stories find new listeners. And if you have a moment, please press that hype button so this story can be shared with even more people. Thank you again.